Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how you can use the combination of Quarto and GitHub Pages to create your own open education materials. In this video, we're going to focus on creating books, and it provides a really modifiable way of being able to create materials for either students, other researchers, and it really helps you for sharing, being able to share this openly in comparison to restrictive, expensive textbooks. So once you get into the workflow, you can create your own textbooks and you can give them students. And it's a really flexible way of either just using text, like traditional textbooks. You can add images, you can add code, you can add graphs. So it provides a really flexible way of being able to create content for your students. In the chapter accompanying this, you'll be able to see how you can download the important software that you need for it. So I'll be using RStudio for the Quarto side, and then I like to use GitHub Desktop to be able to create a GitHub repository and then interact with the online browser version. So for the process that we'll be going through, we'll first create the book in Quarto. So we need to develop the initial files and create the initial template. Once we have that, we can associate this with a GitHub repository. So if you've never used GitHub before, this is like an online version control system where you control files. Traditionally, it's designed for sharing code, but we can use it here for when we create it in Quarto. You can essentially produce like little HTML pages that websites use, and this is what you would show people. Once you've created that, within GitHub, there is a function called GitHub Pages, which for the documents like HTML pages in your repository, you can open it in as a website and give people the link. So this is what makes it really easy to be able to share the materials that you create with your target audience. And then once we've finished that process, you can then cycle through, you can edit the book, push for changes. So for example, if you notice typos, if there is additional features you want to create, it makes it really easy to be able to update this content in comparison to, say, a textbook that is locked in and you can no longer change it. So we'll demonstrate each step of this process.
In this first part, we're going to create the initial book in Quarto. So if you're a little bit unfamiliar with RStudio, we're not going to do a grand tour for this demonstration, but just to highlight some of the key windows. On the left here, we have our console, which is where you can type code. We'll be opening it up in a Quarto file in a moment, but just to highlight this area. In the top right, we have our environment, and in the bottom right, we have our files. But we're going to be using our projects, which organize your files in its own kind of working directory. And it's a really handy way of organizing your files, making sure that your working directory is looking for files relative to its starting point. And for creating the book and the different outputs that I've included in the chapter, it includes some template files which get you started really quickly. So in the window, there's a couple of different ways you can start it, where there's either an icon here to create a new project. In the top right, there's also a project. But if we click here, we're going to be creating a new directory as we don't have a folder yet. Here are all the different project types you can start with. In the chapter, I demonstrate a couple of the others like websites, blogs, but today we're going to be looking at books. For the directory name, this is going to be the name of your folder. So the idea is that it should be as short as possible so it's easy to type and read while informative enough that you know what it represents. So for this demonstration, I'm going to make like a book. Imagining we're introducing the concept of power analysis. So I could call it something like introduction underscore power. The underscore is a little bit old-fashioned, but normally it's a good idea to avoid spaces if you can for the directories. It just makes it easier to type. For where we're going to save it, it's a good idea for a couple of steps down the line when we associate it with a GitHub repository that you save it outside of things like OneDrive. So on my computer, if I browse through my files, within Documents, I have a folder dedicated to my GitHub repositories. So think at this point where you would like to save your book, but I have this Git repo. So we don't want to click on any of these other folders to save within it. We're just going to have it as a repositories folder. open, and then we can leave all the rest of the sections by their defaults. So if we click Create Project, after a moment or so, we will get the initial book project. So this is the initial files that you will get for the book template, which gets us a long way. So to highlight a couple of the key features, we have an index file, which, because we'll be rendering it to a HTML file that we need for a website, every web page needs an index file, and this will be like the opening page to your book. It's normally the little welcome or overview, and it'll be the landing page that people will go on. So within Quarto, there's an option to either type it as a visual text editor, so kind of like how you'd use a normal Word document, where you can add headings, you can add bold, but the background to Quarto is it uses what's called Markdown, which is a kind of programming language um, for typesetting. So, for example, one hash is a level one header. We can add code chunks, we can add links. So we will delete these because we don't need them, and we can type something like, "Welcome to this book on paraanalysis." This little tag at the end, so when we see the book in a moment, each chapter will be numbered in the order you set it as. But if we have this little tag here for unnumbered, you can set chapters to not have a number. So you only normally do this for the index or preface here, and the references also doesn't have it as well. So we save that. The next step is in the quarto.yml, which stands for YAML. And this is the configuration file. So this is the settings for your book, and it's where you can control things like the title, the author, the date, the chapter orders. So when you come to make your own book, if you want to add additional chapters, this is where you can control it. We can set a bibliography. So I won't be going over it in this video, but you can add a bib file, and this will help you add citations, and it will format the reference list that you would like your sources to be cited in. And then there's things like the format. So by default, it will set it to render as HTML, and we can set the theme. We're going to delete this PDF option. So if you do want to have a PDF of the book as well, you can leave that in. But for this, we're just going to render it in HTML, and that's all people will see. So for example, the title, I'm going to make this a little bit more sensible. So I'm going to call it something like Introduction to Paraanalysis. And this is going to be the title of your book that you'll see at the top of the web page. I'm going to change it to my name. So at this point, obviously add in your own details that you want to make for your own book. It's in the US style of date, so we need to flip these around. And if we save that, so at this point, we've only edited a couple of details where in the index, we've just added a tiny welcome. We've added our own details to the YAML file. So at this point, just to check everything's working, what we're going to do is click render. You'll see in the bottom here, it is processing the files. So it's normally a good idea to make sure you render it nice and early, as you know everything works. So now you will have the initial version. So you can see here in the top left, it's our introduction to paraanalysis. We've got the title at the top. We've got our author. Turns out I flipped the date around backwards again. So I'll flip that back in a moment. We have our preface here, which is our index page. We have one chapter for the introduction. We have a second chapter here for the summary and references here. So you can see this Knut reference comes from the introduction chapter. And this is how citations will look if you add the bib file yourself. So if we go back to RStudio, the one other change I'm going to make is turning this back. And because we've rendered it, the one additional change we need to make in project is at the moment we have underscore book, which when we write in the chapters like index and the individual smaller chapters, we write it in Markdown in these Quarto files. and you can save it, but it won't actually be reflected in what we want to see on a website until we actually render them. So I can edit this and save it, and it won't actually be reflected in the changes until we render it. And when we do render it, so like we've just previewed, the files that you want to show people will be in this subdirectory called underscore book. So if we click in here, you can see in the files, we have index, we have intro, we have our summary, and these are the HTML pages that will be displayed as our website. So at this point, what we're going to do here is after line 2 in the YAML file, we're going to add a different option where we're going to put output-dir, and dir stands for directory. So what we're going to do is type docs, go back to index, and click render. So making sure we've saved the YAML first. So this will open up as a preview again, just skimming through some of the chapters. And if we go back to our studio, what we'll see is we now have a different folder called docs. And if we go in there, everything exactly the same as we've just seen in our underscore book folder. It won't be immediately clear while we do this, but it's an important step to make sure when we associate the book with GitHub later on and activate GitHub pages, it will make our life easy then. So what we can do here is if we tick next to book, we can delete that as we don't need it anymore. Everything we need is within docs. So this is your initial version of the book. We haven't gone through editing the chapters, adding more. We covered that in the book. All we're doing at this point is just getting our initial book working so you can save it and we can go through the process. To start step 2, you need to go to GitHub Desktop. So there are different ways around this. So personally, I like to use the desktop app as I'm not super comfortable using the command line to be creating repositories and committing the changes. Yours will look a little less busy. So if you're using this for the first time, yours will be blank in your repositories as you've probably not created any, but I use this for a bunch of different projects so you can see all the ones I have access to. So the basic principles behind GitHub is it uses what's called Git, which is a version control system, kind of like OneDrive, where it tracks changes from files you save. And when you update the files, you check in and out the changes you've made. So you kind of document what changes you've made, so you can save those changes and potentially go back to another version. So this is a good way of managing your files. So traditionally it's been used for software development. So this is why we're using it here to be able to host our files, and it's what we're going to be taking advantage of to get our books online. So we have our folder, we've created the book. You could have actually done this process backwards. So if you're more used to using GitHub, by all means, adopt your own workflow where you create a GitHub repository first and then add your files into it. But what we're going to do is associate the folder we've just created with a GitHub repository. So what we need in the taskbar in the sort of top left, we want add. So we're going to click add existing repository. And what we need to search for is in our repositories folder or wherever you just saved the book you created, we want to find it. So I've created this introduction underscore power. What's really important here is if you only select the folder you've created, we don't want to double click it as it can do weird stuff. It will open a GitHub repository as like a subdirectory here. What we want to do is associate this folder with a GitHub repository. So just highlighting it, click open. If we click add repository, you will get this little warning saying, oh, it doesn't actually appear to be a Git repository at this point, because the idea behind add an existing repository is it's one you've already created. But what it will do is it will auto complete some of the details. So if we click on this, create a repository, it will add the name that we already have. It's already completed the local path, so where we've just selected through that browse. And then the final thing we want here is under git ignore, What we want to do is scroll all the way down and we want to select R. So a gitignore file is a file that exists within the directory that will list all the files and folders that you don't want it to track. So by default, when we associate our folder with a GitHub repository, what you can do is if you don't add any further instructions, what will happen is it will just try and track everything. One of the problems is there's a bunch of things that R will save and update that we really don't want to associate with our GitHub repository. Not that it's harmful in any way, it's just really annoying. So what a gitignore file does is it will list all the things we don't really want to track. And it makes our lives easy if we do it at this point before we start committing the changes, as if you already track a file and then no longer want to do so, it takes a little bit more of an advanced understanding of GitHub to be able to ignore that file and stop tracking it. As once you do it, it will always, even if you add it to the gitignore file, you've already checked it out, so it will always want to do it unless you say otherwise. So we're just going to add this gitignore function here. So if we click create repository, if we go back to RStudio, what you'll see here is now we've created the initial GitHub repository. We now have a couple of different files that are in that we can access. So one is this .gitignore that I just talked about. And these are the things that it's telling us not to track. So it's things like the history, the data, checking out the project, which can be a little bit annoying. And what we're looking out for is this package down site. So docs slash. We actually do want to track this as it's what we want available for our GitHub repository. So what we're going to do is delete this, click save. And then now if we go back to GitHub, what we're going to do is publish a repository. Because this is the first time we're doing it, we're adding this name, introduction_power. If you probably don't have a choice here, so I have what's called a GitHub education account, which is for free, but you have to sign up for it. So for anyone who works in a university or a school, providing that you've got ID that you can prove you work there, you can apply for an education account. If you don't have this, it won't let you keep the code private. So normally I would untick this, so just to let anyone see the code. But because I'm just using it for the demonstration purpose, I'm pretty much going to delete it immediately afterwards. I'm just going to keep it private for now. So if we click publish repository, we need to do this to actually send these changes we've made and establish it on GitHub. And at this point, because we because we deleted docs from our gitignore file, we've already got a bunch of changes to make on here. So the basic functions of GitHub are anything with a minus would be we've deleted a file. So we've now associated our folder with GitHub, and it's now starting to track those changes. Anything with a kind of amber square with a dot in the middle, this is a file that we've modified. So if we click on .gitignore, it shows us that between line 42 and 44, we've deleted docs from it because we do actually want to check, we do actually want to track the documents. And then the green plus sign is all the new files that we're associating with this. So what we're going to do here is this is where the basic function of GitHub comes in. What we want to do is commit those changes. So we have our initial repository, but what we want to do is timestamp it at a specific point in time. So what we're doing is think about this in terms of milestones. So you don't want to do it after, say, editing every single line, but you also don't want to do it after, say, making major edits to 5 different chapters. The background to this is it's used in software development. So the idea is that you can track important changes. So you can see if there is a mistake or if there's something that you want to revert back to, you can identify kind of key milestones in time. So you have to add a commit message. So in this box, we're going to say something like add documents to GitHub. If it starts getting really long, you'll get a prompt saying messages are much more effective if you keep it shorter. So you can keep a kind of shorter title and then add a longer description. And if we click commit these 22 files, we've added one commit to our kind of list. So at this point, you could just keep going and editing files and committing them. But at this point in time, it hasn't actually reached GitHub yet for your repository. So what you need to do to actually save it to your GitHub repository is click push. And this is taking those files and saving it on your GitHub repository. So from your own local computer and associating it online with GitHub. Now that you've pushed those changes, you've established your repository, what you need to do now for this third step is go to your GitHub profile. So you should be logged in to your own GitHub account if you followed the kind of setup instructions. And again, yours will look much less busy. If you're using this for the first time, you should only have one repository. Again, I use this for a bunch of different projects, so there's a lot more stuff going on. But by this point, because you've published your repository, you've pushed that initial change for the git ignore file, what we're looking for in repository is what you've just created. So if scrolling here at the top, I've created this introduction underscore power repository, and we have all our documents here. So we can see we have two commits. That's the initial one where we've saved all the files. And then we also have doc saved, which is what we've just pushed those changes for after we edited the git ignore file. So we can see everything here, and we have all our files on GitHub, but we still can't see it yet as a website. So to activate GitHub Pages, what we need to do is go into settings, scroll down, and on the left-hand side in the menu, you'll be able to see pages. So GitHub Pages is a way that you can host your own website from files in a GitHub repository. So by default, it's not enabled. And what we need to do is click this button. So we want to go from none to selecting the main branch. So a branch in GitHub is a specific version of a code. If you want to look into some of the advanced features, you can create multiple branches, but the main one is what you have saved to your repository. By default, it's set to the root of a branch, which is like the main folder. So the root would be your main introduction underscore power or whatever you've saved your book as. It's looking relative to there. But the reason we saved our files as docs and we changed that output directory is if we click on here, what we want to do is select the /docs folder. So what that means is for when it's looking to build this as a web page, it's going to look for files within docs. So that's why we changed it within the YAML file, because it makes our life much easier when we're selecting the directory here, because you can't actually edit that. So you need a folder called docs for it to be able to show. So if we click save, that is everything we need. So you'll get this little caution. Well, I will because I've set the repository as private, but because I'm publishing it as a website, you'll be able to see the URL, even though you're keeping the repository private. But it will take a minute or so for it to actually enable and build behind the scenes. So once you've established that, what you should see is this kind of little amber pending icon. And that's saying that it's not ready yet, it's still building behind the scenes. So while that is building in the background, we're going to create one additional kind of feature where in about we didn't add a description earlier on, so giving a longer description about what our repository includes. But one handy little feature is if you click this cog icon, there's a button where you can use your GitHub Pages website as a URL here. So you can't edit this. It will just auto-complete based on your repository name and your GitHub account. So by ticking this and saving the changes, it will add the URL here, which means it will be much easier to navigate to the website that you're creating. And this is what you can give your students. This is what you can give researchers, whoever you're wanting to disseminate your work to. And this is what you can give them to show it them as a website. So we now have a green tick that shows it's been successful. So if we click here, we can now see our book. So this is what we've created so far, and it's just opening like any regular website. So we can see we've got our introduction to paraanalysis, we can click through the chapters, and this is our initial version of the book. For the fourth step, as one final demonstration here, what I'm going to do is just demonstrate what you need to do to actually get your edits visible to people. So we've already demonstrated this concept of committing, like saving changes and then committing them to the repository, but I just want to demonstrate what you need to do to actually get that to show people. So for example, say we go back to our book in RStudio. For example, say I want to edit the introduction chapter. So remember, for each chapter, we need one level 1 markdown header. So I'm going to change this to something like Introduction to Paraanalysis. And instead of the kind of default settings, I'm going to put something like, this is a book about paraanalysis. I'm going to add a level 2 header just to show what this will look like. So for example, say in this introductory chapter, I'm explaining all the different concepts about what's behind paraanalysis. So we can say something like, what is the type 1 error rate we want to control? And now we save the change. So remember, we've edited it in Quarto. We've saved it. If we look on our GitHub desktop, we can see that this is now tracked the change. We can see there's been an edit, but it's only changed the Quarto file. So what we need to do to actually make that visible is we need to render it. So depending on how you're opening this, is if you make the edit and you're already previewing every time you save it, it will re-render. Depending on what kind of change you make is whether it will do it automatically or not, but you need to save it first. So here we've re-rendered it. It's changed the chapter title to Introduction to Paraanalysis. We've got this subheading of alpha now, and we can go through our chapters. References will be blank now because we've got rid of the citation. The preface we never actually edited. And that is us making one additional edit. If we look at GitHub Desktop, we've now got a bunch of other changes because we've re-rendered it, we've made changes reflected in the HTML files, and that is what we want to be able to show and reflect in those changes. So for example, say we now want to add another commit message saying edits to chapter 1. We can commit that change. We need to push to origin. So remember the key concepts behind GitHub is we start by fetching the origin. So the first time you log into your computer, you want to make sure that the files on your computer are the latest versions, taking that from your GitHub repository. Once you've committed changes, you would push them to your GitHub repository. And then the other option is if there are edits on GitHub that aren't on your computer, this will say pull. So it's pull, push, commit. The terminology will take a little bit of time to get used to. So we've made the edit, we've made sure we've rendered it and reflected that in the HTML files. We've committed that change and we've pushed it to GitHub. So if we go back to our GitHub repository and refresh the page, we can see our commit message is showing up. It's showing as edits to chapter 1. We've only edited and pushed for changes to some of them. So for example, in docs, it's saying edits to chapter 1. We've got changes in intro, but the other ones are 14 minutes ago as we haven't edited them. So we've still got this amber icon. It will take a minute or so to build the page. So now we've got a green tick. It's showing it's been successful. So if we click on this URL link, Sometimes what you'll find is at the moment we can still see introduction. It's not updated. The one thing to keep in mind is depending on your browser settings, if it's saving cookies, it might initially just reload to the same page. So if it doesn't look like it's updated yet, if you click refresh, it will now be able to show. So clicking on introduction, refreshing again, it's now got those changes reflected. So we've got introduction to power analysis, we've got our new subheading, and the same thing will happen to some of the different chapters. So this is really going to depend on your browser settings and if it's saving the cookies and saving the files and not wanting to reload them. Don't panic. It's not a problem. It might just be that they've not reloaded yet. So at this point, you now have all the tools in place that you can create your own book. So go and have a look at the Quarto guide, have a look in the dissemination book that I've put together, and now you can use these tools to make the content that you can disseminate with students, with other researchers, and you can put these tools in place to share your own work.